Poor boy with one leg helps an elderly man cross the street. The next day, something unimaginable happens. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest impact. Lucas, a resilient young boy living with only one leg, decides to help a blind elderly man cross a chaotic street. For many, it might seem like just a moment of kindness. But for Lucas, it marks the beginning of a journey that will change his life in ways he could never have imagined. What happens when a simple act of generosity uncovers secrets of the past, rebuilds broken bridges, and transforms not just one life, but an entire community? Will Lucas find the courage to face challenges greater than any he has ever known? This is yet another heartfelt story from Living Narratives, where you experience the true emotion of stories that make you reflect on life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and join us as we uncover this powerful and inspiring journey. Lucas limped through the crowded streets, his single crutch creaking faintly with each step. The chaos of honking cars, vendors shouting out prices, and the chatter of passers-by filled the air. But Lucas was used to the noise. It was part of his daily life, just like the worn-out sneakers on his feet and the slight ache in his shoulder from supporting his weight on one side. At only 12 years old, Lucas had already mastered the art of blending in, despite the conspicuous absence of his left leg. To him, it wasn't a limitation, it was just another part of who he was. As he approached the intersection, Lucas noticed the usual flurry of activity, children running, impatient drivers yelling, and street vendors peddling their wares. But something caught his attention. A frail old man standing hesitantly at the edge of the curb. The man clutched a white cane tightly in his hand, his other arm trembling slightly as he reached out tentatively. His face was etched with worry, his cloudy eyes darting in the direction of the roaring traffic. No one seemed to notice him, or if they did, they simply walked past, absorbed in their own routines. Lucas paused, his gaze fixed on the man. Something stirred within him, a sense of responsibility perhaps, or the quiet voice of his late father, who had always told him, "Son, if you can help someone, you should." Without a second thought, Lucas tucked his schoolbooks under his arm and made his way toward the man. The uneven rhythm of his crutch tapping against the pavement went unnoticed amidst the cacophony. "Excuse me, sir," Lucas said, his voice steady but kind. The man turned his head slightly, as if trying to place the sound. "Do you need help crossing the street?" The man hesitated, his expression softening into one of relief. "Oh, bless you, young man. I've been standing here for what feels like an eternity. These cars, they don't seem to stop." Lucas smiled faintly, positioning himself beside the man. "Don't worry, I've got you." He adjusted his grip on the crutch, extending his free arm for the man to hold. The elderly man's hand was cold and frail, yet it gripped Lucas's arm with surprising strength. Navigating the crossing was no easy feat. The traffic seemed relentless, the drivers impatient. Lucas raised his crutch slightly, signaling to an oncoming car to slow down. He felt the rush of wind as a motorcycle sped past too closely, the rider yelling something incoherent. But Lucas didn't falter. Step by step, he guided the man across, his own movements deliberate and careful despite the imbalance of his gait. When they finally reached the other side, the man let out a shaky breath. "Thank you, son. Truly, I don't know what I would have done without you." Lucas shrugged, his modesty as natural as his kindness. "It's no big deal. Just glad I could help." The man reached into his pocket, pulling out a small crumpled note. "At least, let me—" "No, sir," Lucas interrupted gently, raising his hand. "You don't need to pay me. Just take care of yourself, okay?" The old man smiled, his milky eyes glistening. "You're a good soul. The world needs more boys like you." Lucas watched as the man shuffled away, his heart warmed by the simple act. Yet, as he turned back toward the road, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more significant than it seemed. It wasn't often that life paused to give Lucas moments like these, moments that felt bigger than the hustle and grind of his daily existence. That evening, as he sat with his mother in their modest home, Lucas recounted the story. His mother, a woman worn down by years of hard work, yet unyielding in her love for her son, listened intently. "You did a good thing, Lucas," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Kindness always finds its way back to you." Lucas nodded, her words resonating, though he couldn't imagine how or when that kindness might return. To him, it was just another day, another small gesture. Little did he know, the wheels of fate had already begun to turn. The next morning, as the sun painted the sky in hues of gold and pink, Lucas was jolted from his thoughts by the sound of a sleek car pulling up in front of their home. The vehicle was unlike anything he'd ever seen, polished to perfection, its chrome details glinting in the light. The door opened, and out stepped a sharply dressed man, his presence commanding yet approachable. "Lucas?" the man called, his voice deep but friendly. Lucas exchanged a puzzled glance with his mother before stepping outside. "Yes, sir?" the man smiled. "My name is William. I work for Mr. Henry, the gentleman you helped yesterday. He asked me to deliver a message and an invitation." Lucas's heart raced, a mix of curiosity and apprehension swirling within him. "Invitation?" William nodded, extending a neatly folded envelope. "He'd like to thank you properly. And trust me, young man, this is an opportunity you don't want to miss." Lucas hesitated, his fingers brushing the envelope's crisp edges. For a boy who had grown accustomed to life's struggles, the idea of something extraordinary felt both exhilarating and surreal. As he unfolded the letter, the words within hinted at possibilities he had never dared to dream. And so, with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty, Lucas stood at the threshold of a journey that would test not just his courage, but the very essence of who he was. The first step had been a simple act of kindness. What lay ahead would change his life forever. Lucas woke up the next morning feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. The mysterious invitation from Mr. Henry, delivered so formally by the man's assistant, William, sat on the table next to his bed. The paper felt heavier than it should, as if the words inside carried more meaning than he could yet comprehend. He couldn't help but replay the events of the previous day in his mind, the moment he had helped the elderly man cross the chaotic street, and the gratitude in the man's shaky voice as he held Lucas's hand. It had felt like the right thing to do, something anyone would have done. Yet now the world around him seemed to shift, as if a single act of kindness had set something much bigger into motion. "Lucas, breakfast!" his mother called from their small kitchen. Her voice was gentle but firm, as it always was when she sensed he was overthinking something. Lucas swung his legs over the side of the bed, his prosthetic leg resting against the wall. He carefully strapped it on, the routine so ingrained it required no thought, though he winced slightly as it pressed against a sensitive spot. At the table, his mother placed a plate of toast and eggs in front of him and sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She studied him for a moment, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You've been quiet this morning," she said finally, her voice soft. "Are you thinking about the invitation?" Lucas nodded, chewing on a piece of toast. "Do you think we should go?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "It's just weird. I only helped him cross the street. It's not like I did something amazing." His mother tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Lucas, you've always underestimated the power of your kindness. Maybe what you did was exactly what he needed at that moment. And maybe this invitation is more than just a thank you. It could be an opportunity." Lucas looked down at his plate, the corners of his mouth twitching in a reluctant smile. "An opportunity for what?" he murmured. "To feel even more out of place?" His mother reached across the table, resting her hand on his. "You've faced tougher things than feeling out of place, mio figlio. Whatever this is, you're strong enough to handle it." Later that afternoon, the familiar black car pulled up outside their modest home, its polished exterior gleaming in the sunlight. William stepped out, impeccably dressed as always, and greeted them with his usual polite smile. "Good afternoon, Lucas. Mrs. Silver," he said, inclining his head respectfully. "Mr. Henry is looking forward to meeting you again." The car ride was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional chirping of birds outside. Lucas stared out the window, watching as the scenery changed. The cracked sidewalks and worn buildings of his neighborhood gave way to wide streets lined with trees, their leaves shimmering in the golden afternoon light. Large, elegant houses appeared, each one more grand than the last. Lucas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't belong here. His mother, sensing his unease, gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "It's just a house," she whispered. "Remember, it's the people inside that matter." When they arrived at Mr. Henry's estate, Lucas's breath caught. The mansion was enormous, its white pillars towering like sentinels guarding the entrance. The garden was meticulously maintained, with vibrant flowers arranged in symmetrical patterns. It looked like something out of a storybook, a place so far removed. From his reality, it almost didn't feel real. William led them inside, where the cool air smelled faintly of lavender and polished wood. The grandeur of the interior was overwhelming. Marble floors, high ceilings adorned with chandeliers, and walls lined with portraits and bookshelves. Lucas clutched his mother's hand, his confidence faltering. "Lucas!" A warm, gravelly voice greeted them. Mr. Henry appeared at the top of a grand staircase, descending slowly with the help of a cane. Despite his frailty, there was an undeniable strength in his presence. His sharp eyes, though clouded with age, sparkled with gratitude as he approached. "You've come," Mr. Henry said, his smile genuine. "Welcome." Lucas shifted awkwardly, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you for inviting us," he managed, his voice quiet. Mr. Henry chuckled, the sound echoing softly through the vast hall. "It's me who should be thanking you," he said. "You didn't just help me cross a street, young man. You reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten, the power of a simple act of kindness." He led them to a sitting room, where plush armchairs surrounded a low table set with tea and biscuits. As they sat down, Mr. Henry began to share more about himself. He spoke of his years as a successful businessman, his work as a philanthropist, and how, in recent years, he had become more reclusive, withdrawing from the world as his health declined. The incident on the street, he explained, had been a wake-up call. "When you stopped to help me, Lucas, it wasn't just my life you saved," Mr. Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "You reminded me that there's still goodness in this world, and I want to repay that." Lucas blinked in surprise as Mr. Henry revealed his plan. He wanted to provide Lucas with a state-of-the-art prosthetic leg, one that would allow him to move with greater ease and comfort. But that wasn't all. He also offered a scholarship to one of the city's best schools, an opportunity that could change Lucas's life forever. I don't know what to say," Lucas stammered, his mind racing. He glanced at his mother, who was just as stunned but nodded encouragingly. "There is one condition," Mr. Henry added, his tone gentle but firm. "I need your help with something very personal." Lucas frowned, curious. "What is it?" Mr. Henry's expression grew serious. "My family. We've grown apart over the years. My children won't speak to me. I want to make things right before it's too late, and I believe you, Lucas, might be the one to help me." Lucas stared at the old man, the weight of the request settling heavily on his shoulders. He had never been asked to do something so significant before. But as he looked into Mr. Henry's eyes, filled with hope and vulnerability, he knew he couldn't say no. "I'll try," Lucas said finally, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his chest. "I'll do my best." Mr. Henry's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you, Lucas. I believe you can do this." As they left the mansion that evening, Lucas's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The scholarship and prosthetic leg were incredible gifts, but it was the responsibility of helping Mr. Henry that weighed heaviest on him. He had no idea how he would accomplish such a task, but deep down, he knew this was just the beginning of something far greater than he could imagine. The next morning, Lucas awoke with a sense of determination mingled with nervousness. The events of the previous day had shaken his routine, introducing possibilities and responsibilities he hadn't foreseen. He stared at the prosthetic leg resting beside his bed, a reminder of how far he'd come, and how much further he was expected to go. His mother entered the room quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Today is a new step, Lucas," she said, her voice warm but tinged with caution. "You have a chance to do something special, not just for yourself, but for someone else. Take it one moment at a time." Lucas nodded, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He knew she believed in him, even if he wasn't yet sure he believed in himself. After breakfast, the now familiar black car arrived to pick him up. William greeted him with his usual polite demeanor, though there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes, as if he were just as invested in Lucas's journey as Mr. Henry was. The car ride was quiet, the city bustling outside the tinted windows. Lucas replayed the conversation with Mr. Henry in his mind. The old man's request had been simple in words but monumental in implication. Reunite a broken family. Lucas had no idea where to start, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to do this. When they arrived at the estate, Mr. Henry was waiting for him in the garden, sitting on a bench beneath a canopy of vibrant flowers. The morning sunlight cast a golden glow over the scene, but Lucas barely noticed the beauty around him. His thoughts were consumed by the task ahead. "Good morning, Lucas." Mr. Henry greeted him with a kind smile. "I'm glad you came." Lucas hesitated before sitting down next to him. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for this," he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't even know where to begin." Mr. Henry chuckled softly, the sound warm and reassuring. "None of us do at first," he said, "but sometimes all it takes is one small step. My children, Charles and Sophie, are like strangers to me now. Years of misunderstandings and mistakes have built walls between us, but I believe those walls can be broken down." Lucas frowned, his mind racing. "Why do you think I can help?" Mr. Henry's expression grew serious. "Because you remind me of what I've lost. Your kindness, your courage. It's the kind of light they need to see, and maybe, through you, they'll remember the love we once shared." Lucas didn't know how to respond to that. He felt an immense pressure, but also a flicker of purpose. If Mr. Henry believed in him, maybe he could believe in himself too. William approached them with a folder in hand, interrupting the moment. "This contains some background on Charles and Sophie," he explained, handing it to Lucas. "It's not much, but it might help you understand them better." Lucas opened the folder hesitantly. Inside were photographs and brief descriptions of Mr. Henry's children. Charles, the eldest, was a successful businessman with a hardened expression and a sharp suit. Sophie, younger by a few years, was an artist with a free-spirited smile that seemed out of place in her strained relationship with her father. "They're so different," Lucas murmured, studying the photos. "Different, yes," Mr. Henry agreed, "but they're both a part of me just as much as I'm a part of them. I've made mistakes, Lucas, mistakes that pushed them away, but I want to make amends before it's too late." Lucas closed the folder, his resolve hardening. "I'll do what I can," he said, "but I'll need your help too." Mr. Henry smiled, a glimmer of hope lighting his eyes. "We'll do this together." Later that afternoon, William drove Lucas to Charles's office, a sleek building towering over the bustling city streets. The contrast between the polished corporate world and Lucas's modest upbringing couldn't have been starker. He adjusted his prosthetic leg nervously, feeling out of place in the immaculate lobby. When they reached Charles's office, Lucas was struck by the man's imposing presence. Charles was seated behind a massive desk, his sharp eyes studying Lucas with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "So, you're the boy my father's been talking about," Charles said, his tone cool but not unkind. "What exactly do you want from me?" Lucas hesitated, his throat dry. He wasn't sure how to begin, but he knew he had to try. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said. Finally, his voice steadied despite his nerves. "Your father, he just wants to talk. He misses you." Charles's expression hardened. "Misses me? After all these years of silence? It's a bit late for that, don't you think?" Lucas took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe it is," he admitted, "but maybe it's not. I don't know your story, and I won't pretend to, but I do know that he cares about you, and I think, deep down, you care about him too." Charles leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. For a moment, Lucas thought he had failed, but then Charles opened a drawer and pulled out an old photograph. It was a picture of a younger Mr. Henry holding a baby. Charles, Lucas realized. He was a good father once, Charles said quietly, almost to himself. But life happened, and we grew apart. I don't know if I can forgive him for some of the things he did or didn't do. Lucas nodded, understanding more than he expected to. "Maybe forgiveness doesn't happen all at once," he said. "Maybe it's just a choice you make, one step at a time." Charles studied him for a long moment before placing the photograph on the desk. "I'll think about it," he said finally. But no. Promises. It wasn't the breakthrough Lucas had hoped for, but it was a start. As he left the office, he felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could help mend what was broken. And maybe, in the process, he would discover something new about himself too. As Lucas returned home that evening, his mind replayed the encounter with Charles. He had expected resistance, but the flicker of vulnerability in Charles' eyes had been enough to ignite a small ember of hope. He shared every detail of the meeting with his mother, who listened intently while preparing dinner. "Sometimes, Lucas, it takes more than words to mend a broken heart," she said gently, placing a steaming plate in front of him. "Actions speak louder, especially when someone has been hurt for so long." Lucas nodded, pondering her advice. Charles had agreed to consider speaking with his father, but the weight of their estranged relationship was palpable. Tomorrow he would face Sophie, the younger sibling, with a history as intricate and wounded as Charles's. Lucas knew he had to tread carefully. The following morning, William arrived once more, this time to escort Lucas to Sophie's art studio. The drive was quieter than the last, the air thick with anticipation. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie's response might be even colder than Charles's. William seemed to sense his unease and offered a reassuring smile as they pulled up to a quaint building tucked away in a quieter part of the city. "This might not be easy," William said as Lucas climbed out of the car. "Sophie, she carries a lot of pain, but if anyone can get through to her, it's you." The studio was a burst of color and creativity, with paintings of all sizes lining the walls. The smell of oil, paints, and fresh canvas filled the air, but Lucas barely noticed. Sophie stood at the far end, her back to him, as she worked on a large canvas. Her movements were fluid, yet deliberate, each stroke of the brush telling a story. "Excuse me," Lucas said hesitantly, his voice breaking the silence. Sophie froze mid-stroke, her shoulders tensing before she turned around. Her piercing eyes locked onto his, a mix of curiosity and wariness in her gaze. "Who are you?" she asked, her tone clipped. "My name is Lucas," he began, taking a cautious step forward. "I'm here because of your father." At the mention of her father, Sophie's expression darkened. She set her brush down with a deliberate motion, crossing her arms. "I don't want to hear anything about him," she said firmly. "You're wasting your time." Lucas swallowed hard, his nerves threatening to betray him, but he remembered his mother's words and took a deep breath. "I understand how you feel," he said quietly, "but your father, he's trying to make things right. He asked me to help because he doesn't know how to reach you." Sophie let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Right. Now he wants to make things right. After all these years? Where was he when I needed him most?" Lucas could see the pain etched into her features, the walls she had built around herself. "I don't know what happened between you and your father," he admitted, "but I do know that he regrets whatever he did, or didn't do, and I think he's afraid it's too late to fix it." Sophie's eyes softened for a moment before hardening again. "It is too late," she said, turning back to her canvas. "You can tell him that." Lucas felt a pang of frustration, but refused to give up. "Sophie," he said, his voice firmer now, "I've lived my whole life believing that some things were impossible. Walking without crutches, going to school without being stared at, even finding kindness in strangers. But I've learned that the only thing stopping us is the walls we build around ourselves." Sophie paused, her hand hovering over the canvas. Lucas took another step, closer, his voice softening. "Maybe it's not about forgiving him for his sake. Maybe it's about letting go for your own." For a long moment, the studio was silent. Then, without turning around, Sophie said, "You don't know what you're asking." "I'm not asking," Lucas replied gently. "I'm just hoping." Sophie finally turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not making any promises." It wasn't the resolution Lucas had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. As he left the studio, he felt a mix of relief and determination. He had planted a seed of hope in both Charles and Sophie. Now it was up to them to decide what to do with it. Back at the mansion, Mr. Henry was waiting for him, a hopeful smile on his face. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice tinged with anticipation. "They both said they'd think about it," Lucas replied honestly. "It's not much, but it's a start." Mr. Henry nodded, his eyes glistening with emotion. "Sometimes a start is all we need," he said. "Thank you, Lucas. You've done more than I could have ever hoped." As Lucas left the mansion that evening, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time he believed that healing was possible, not just for Mr. Henry and his family, but for himself as well. Lucas's determination only grew stronger as the days went on. His interactions with Charles and Sophie had shown him that their pain ran deep, but it had also revealed glimmers of hope. He knew this family's fractured bonds couldn't be mended overnight, but he wasn't ready to give up. Every step forward, no matter how small, brought them closer to something better. One afternoon, Lucas sat in Mr. Henry's study, flipping through an old family photo album that the elderly man had handed him. The pages were filled with memories, vacations, birthdays, and candid moments that painted a picture of a once happy family. Lucas paused on a photo of a much younger Mr. Henry, standing proudly beside a treehouse he'd built for Charles and Sophie. "They loved that treehouse," Mr. Henry said from his chair by the window, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "We used to spend entire afternoons up there, telling stories and playing games. I thought those moments would last forever." Lucas closed the album gently, looking at the man who had become both a mentor and a friend. "Why don't you build another moment like that?" he suggested. "Something that brings back the good memories, but also creates new ones." Mr. Henry tilted his head, considering Lucas's words. "You think that would make a difference?" "I think it's worth a try," Lucas said with a small smile. "Sometimes actions speak louder than words." Inspired, Mr. Henry decided to revisit the treehouse that had once been the center of his children's world. Lucas accompanied him to the overgrown backyard, where the structure still stood, weathered by time but surprisingly intact. As Mr. Henry ran his hand along the worn wood, a spark of determination lit in his eyes. "We'll fix it," he said firmly. "We'll make it even better than before." Over the next few days, Lucas and Mr. Henry worked side by side, rebuilding the treehouse. It wasn't easy. Mr. Henry's hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and Lucas still struggled with his balance at times. But they didn't let that stop them. With each nail they hammered and each board they replaced, the treehouse began to transform, much like their bond. Word of their project reached Charles and Sophie through William, who had been quietly orchestrating opportunities for the family to reconnect. Intrigued, Charles decided to pay a visit one sunny afternoon. He arrived just as Lucas was carefully painting the treehouse's exterior, his prosthetic leg making it a bit of a challenge. "You're really putting in the work, huh?" Charles said, his voice carrying a hint of admiration. Lucas looked down from his perch on the ladder, surprised but pleased to see Charles. "Someone's got to do it," he replied with a grin. "Besides, your dad says this place used to mean a lot to you and Sophie. I figured it was worth bringing back to life." Charles crossed his arms, his gaze softening as he looked at the nearly finished treehouse. "It does bring back memories," admitted, "good ones." Encouraged by Charles's presence, Lucas climbed down the ladder and handed him a paintbrush. "Want to help?" For a moment, Charles hesitated. Then, with a small nod, he took the brush and began painting alongside Lucas. They worked in companionable silence, the act of rebuilding the treehouse seeming to chip away at the emotional walls Charles had built over the years. Later that evening, Sophie arrived unannounced, curiosity getting the better of her. She stood at the edge of the yard watching as Lucas and Charles added the finishing touches. Mr. Henry, sitting on a nearby bench, noticed her and called out gently, "Sophie, you're here." She hesitated, her emotions warring within her. But as she looked at the treehouse, now restored to its former glory, something inside her shifted. Slowly she walked toward her father, her steps tentative but purposeful. "I didn't think I'd see this place again," Sophie said, her voice barely audible. "It's not just the treehouse," Mr. Henry said, his eyes glistening. "It's what it represents, a time when we were all together, a time I'd give anything to have back." Sophie looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes. "Dad, Her voice broke and she couldn't finish the sentence, but in that moment no words were needed. She stepped forward and embraced him, her arms tight around his frail frame. Charles joined them, drawn by the scene. For the first time in years, the three of them stood together as a family, their pain and regrets momentarily overshadowed by a shared sense of hope. Lucas watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride and relief. He knew this wasn't the end of their journey. It was just the beginning. But seeing the family take their first steps toward healing made every challenge worth it. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the yard, Mr. Henry turned to Lucas and said, "You've done something incredible here, son. You've given us a second chance." Lucas smiled, his voice steady as he replied, "You gave yourself that chance. I just reminded you that it was possible." The next morning, Lucas woke up to the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of his mother humming in the kitchen. The warmth in the air seemed to reflect the small triumph of the day before. But Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to do. Although the reunion had been a powerful moment, he knew that healing years of emotional distance would require more than one heartfelt embrace. After breakfast, William arrived at Lucas's doorstep with an envelope in hand. "Good morning, Lucas," he greeted with a nod. "Mr. Henry wanted me to give you this." Lucas took the envelope, confused. Inside was a handwritten note from Mr. Henry. "Lucas, you've done more for my family in a few days than I've managed in a lifetime. But there's one more thing I need your help with. Meet me at the treehouse this afternoon. There's something I need to show you." Curiosity piqued. Lucas agreed to meet Mr. Henry. By the time he arrived, the older man was already waiting, sitting on the wooden bench beneath the treehouse. In his hands was a small wooden box, its edges worn with age. As Lucas approached, Mr. Henry gestured for him to sit beside him. "This box," Mr. Henry began, "holds pieces of my past, memories, regrets, and truths I've kept hidden for too long. I believe it's time my children know the whole story." Lucas looked at the box, then at Mr. Henry. "What's inside?" Mr. Henry sighed deeply. "Letters I wrote but never sent. Photographs of moments I didn't have the courage to revisit. And this," he pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges yellowed with age. "It's a will I drafted years ago but never updated. In it, I left everything to charity because I believed my children would never forgive me." Lucas frowned. "Why didn't you tell them sooner?" "Fear," Mr. Henry admitted. "I was afraid they'd see it as just another way of trying to control them. But now, thanks to you, I think they might actually listen." Lucas nodded, his resolve strengthening. "Then let's tell them together." Later that afternoon, Lucas, Mr. Henry, and William arranged for Charles and Sophie to meet at the treehouse once more. The siblings arrived, their expressions wary but curious. Lucas noticed the tension between them and their father, a fragile thread of trust that had only just begun to form. Mr. Henry stood, his hands trembling slightly as he held the wooden box. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions coursing through him. "There's something I need to share with both of you, something I should have shared a long time ago." He opened the box and began to pull out its contents. The letters were read aloud, each one revealing a side of Mr. Henry that Charles and Sophie had never known. They heard of his struggles to provide for them after their mother passed, the sacrifices he made to keep them safe, and the mistakes he regretted with every fiber of his being. As Mr. Henry spoke, Lucas watched the expressions on Charles's and Sophie's faces shift. Anger softened into understanding, and the walls they had built began to crumble. When Mr. Henry unfolded the old will, he hesitated before handing it to Charles. "This was my way of punishing myself," he admitted. "I thought I didn't deserve to leave anything for you, but now I realize that withholding the truth was my greatest failure." Charles read the document, his brow furrowing. "Dad, we never wanted your money," he said quietly. "We just wanted you to be honest with us." Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "You didn't have to carry all this alone. We could have helped you." Mr. Henry's voice broke as he replied, "I didn't know how to ask for help." The silence that followed was heavy but healing. Finally, Charles placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "We can't change the past, but we can start over. Together." Sophie stepped forward, taking both her father's and brother's hands. "We've lost too much time already. Let's not waste any more." Lucas felt a surge of pride as he watched the family come together. This was the moment he had been working toward, the reason he had pushed through his own doubts and insecurities. Seeing the Hayes family united was worth every ounce of effort. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Mr. Henry turned to Lucas with gratitude shining in his eyes. "You've given us a gift I never thought possible," he said. "How can I ever repay you?" Lucas smiled, his voice steady as he replied, "You already have. You showed me that no matter how broken things seem, there's always a way to put them back together." For the first time in years, the Hayes family shared a genuine moment of laughter and connection, their hearts lighter and their future brighter. And Lucas, standing on the sidelines, felt a sense of belonging he had never known before. The days following the reunion at the treehouse were marked by cautious but hopeful progress. Lucas continued to visit the Hayes family, not as an outsider, but as someone who had become an integral part of their journey. He began to see the small, meaningful changes that were taking root. Charles making time for family dinners, Sophie calling her father just to check in, and Mr. Henry letting go of the guilt that had weighed him down for so long. One afternoon, as Lucas adjusted to walking with his new prosthetic leg, William approached him with a broad smile. "You're becoming a pro at this," he said, watching as Lucas took steady, confident steps. Lucas laughed, his determination shining through. "It's not easy, but it's worth it." William handed Lucas a letter, its envelope embossed with an elegant seal. "Mr. Henry wanted you to have this." Lucas opened it carefully and read the handwritten note inside. "Dear Lucas, your strength and kindness have not only changed my family, but also inspired me to think beyond what I thought was possible. I believe that second chances are meant to be shared. That's why I've made arrangements to fund a community center in your neighborhood, a place where children like you can dream big and overcome any obstacle. This center will bear your name, Lucas, as a testament to what one act of courage and compassion can achieve. Thank you for reminding me of the power of hope. You are a light in this world. With gratitude, Henry Hayes Lucas." Stared at the letter, his heart pounding. A community center named after him? The idea was almost too big to comprehend. For a boy who had spent so much of his life feeling small and overlooked, this gesture was monumental. When Lucas shared the news with his mother, tears filled her eyes. "You've always been special, Lucas," she said, pulling him into a tight embrace. "But now the whole world will know it too." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Construction on the community center began, and Lucas found himself involved in every step of the process. Mr. Henry made sure Lucas's voice was heard, encouraging him to share his ideas for what the center should offer. Lucas suggested a library, a playground, and a space for kids to learn new skills like art, music, and sports. During one of his visits to the construction site, Lucas noticed Sophie sitting on the steps of the nearly finished building. She waved him over, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said, "when I first met you, I wasn't sure what to think, but now I see why my father believes in you so much. You've given him, and all of us, a reason to hope again." Lucas shrugged modestly. I just to help." "And you did," Sophie said. "But you've done more than that. You've shown us that it's never too late to change." As the opening day of the community center approached, excitement filled the air. The entire neighborhood buzzed with anticipation, and Lucas felt a mix of nerves and pride. This was more than he had ever dreamed of, a place where kids like him could find support, friendship, and opportunities. On the day of the grand opening, the community gathered outside the center, which now proudly displayed its name, the Lucas Foundation for Hope. Lucas stood beside Mr. Henry, Charles, Sophie, and his mother, feeling a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. When it was time for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Mr. Henry handed Lucas the scissors. "This is your moment, Lucas," he said. "You've earned it." Lucas stepped forward, his hand steady as he cut the ribbon. Cheers erupted from the crowd, and Lucas's heart swelled with gratitude. He looked out at the faces of the people who had supported him, his mother, the Hayes family, and the many friends he had made along the way. As the crowd began to explore the center, Lucas took a moment to reflect. His journey had been filled with challenges, but each one had led him to this point. He realized that his story wasn't just about overcoming obstacles, it was about using his experiences to make a difference in the lives of others. That evening, as the sun set and the community center bustled with activity, Lucas stood outside, watching the children play and families connect. Mr. Henry joined him, his eyes filled with pride. "You've created something beautiful, Lucas," Mr. Henry said. "This is your legacy." Lucas smiled, his gaze fixed on the joyful scene before him. "It's not just mine," he replied. "It's ours, all of us." And in that moment, Lucas knew that his life had been forever changed, not just by the kindness of others, but by his own determination to keep moving forward, no matter what. Lucas could hardly sleep the night before. His mind raced with questions about what could have caused the rift between Mr. Henry and his children. He knew that Sophie and Charles harbored deep resentment, but he didn't fully understand the reasons behind it. Why would a man so kind and generous be pushed away by those who should love him the most? Mr. Henry, on the other hand, always seemed burdened, as though carrying an invisible weight, one no one else could help him lift. The following morning, Lucas returned to the mansion for his physiotherapy session. During a break, he found Mr. Henry sitting in his study, a room filled with memories frozen in time. The shelves were lined with old books, framed photos, and a grandfather clock ticking softly in the corner, a constant reminder that life moved forward, even when pain lingered. Lucas hesitated at the door before softly knocking. "Come in, my boy," Mr. Henry called out, his voice hoarse but warm. He was seated in a leather armchair, holding a photo album in hands that trembled slightly. Lucas stepped inside, feeling the gravity of the room's atmosphere. "Are you all right, sir?" Lucas asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. Mr. Henry looked up, surprised by the question. He hesitated before answering, as though deciding how much he could trust the boy who had already done so much for him. "Lucas," Sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry are the ones we place on ourselves. I don't understand. Why are your children so upset with you? Lucas ventured to ask. He knew it was bold, but he felt it was the only way to truly help. Mr. Henry sighed deeply, placing the album on his lap. I've made many mistakes, Lucas. Years ago, when my company began to crumble, I made decisions that I thought would protect my family. But protecting isn't the same as staying close. In my desperation to shield them from what I believed would be financial ruin, I ended up pushing them away. Lucas sat down in the chair across from him, leaning forward. What exactly happened? Mr. Henry looked down at the album and opened it to a page featuring an old photo of his family during a joyful holiday. I sold part of what we owned to pay off debts, including the house where they grew up. Charles was furious. To him, that house symbolized our unity as a family. Sophie, on the other hand, felt betrayed because I hid everything from them. She always said she would rather lose everything as long as we stayed together. But I didn't believe they'd understand. I thought I was doing the right thing. Lucas furrowed his brow, trying to absorb Mr. Henry's words. So, you thought you were protecting them, but instead you created a distance. The old man nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. And now every decision I made back then haunts me. I see how much they suffered, but I don't know if they'll ever forgive me. Lucas felt a pang in his chest. He knew the pain of losing something precious, but he also understood the value of fighting to reclaim it. Mr. Henry, maybe they just need to hear this from you, to know that you truly regret it and that you only wanted the best for them. Do you think it's that simple? Mr. Henry asked skeptically. No, it's not simple, but it's not impossible either. Lucas replied, his determination seeming to outweigh his small frame. You've already taken the first step by asking for help, and I promise I'll do my best to help you fix this. Mr. Henry remained silent for a moment, as though processing the boy's words. Then, with a faint, bittersweet smile, he placed a gentle hand on Lucas's shoulder. You have more courage than many adults I've known in my life, my boy. Perhaps you're right. As Lucas left the study, he felt a new responsibility weighing on his own shoulders. He didn't know exactly how he would help Mr. Henry reconnect with his children, but he knew he had to try. Walking down the corridor, he encountered William, who was waiting patiently. How did it go? The assistant asked, his expression curious. He opened up, Lucas replied. Now we just have to make sure Charles and Sophie open up too. William smiled, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. That won't be easy, but if anyone can do it, it's you, Lucas. In the days that followed, Lucas began to formulate a plan. He would use Sophie's diary and Charles's photograph to create a moment that would bring back the family's happier memories. He knew rebuilding their trust would take time and patience, but he was determined to help Mr. Henry find redemption. The day of the reunion had finally arrived, but Lucas was filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. He stood in the grand living room of Mr. Henry's mansion, clutching the photograph of the family Charles had handed him and Sophie's childhood diary. These were the keys to unlocking the hearts of Mr. Henry's estranged children. He was certain of it. The air in the house was thick with anticipation, and even William, always composed, seemed slightly nervous as he adjusted his tie. Mr. Henry sat in his armchair near the fireplace, his hands clasped tightly together as if to keep them from shaking. He looked at Lucas and gave a small, grateful nod. No matter what happens today, I owe you more than I can ever repay. Lucas smiled, though the weight of what he was about to do pressed heavily on his chest. You don't owe me anything, sir. This is about family, and family is worth fighting for. The doorbell rang, the sound echoing through the house like the chime of a clock counting down to an uncertain fate. William opened the door to reveal Charles and Sophie standing together, their expressions guarded. Charles looked as polished as ever in his suit, but his jaw was tight, and his eyes darted around the room with suspicion. Sophie, on the other hand, wore no mask. Her pain was evident in the lines of her face and the way she avoided looking directly at her father. "Thank you for coming," Mr. Henry said softly, his voice trembling. "It means more to me than I can express." "We're not here for pleasantries," Charles replied, his tone sharp. "You wanted to talk, so talk." Lucas watched the exchange, sensing the tension that threatened to boil over. He stepped forward, holding the photograph and the diary in his hands. "Before we start, I want to share something with both of you." Charles and Sophie turned to him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and impatience. Lucas held up the photograph first. "This is a picture of all of you from when you were a family. Look at your smiles. Those aren't fake. Whatever happened later, there was a time when you all loved each other deeply." Charles hesitated, his eyes softening as he took the photograph from Lucas's hand. He studied it for a moment before passing it to Sophie, who clutched it tightly. "And this," Lucas continued, holding up the diary, "is something I found in Sophie's old room. It's filled with memories of happier times. Sophie, you wrote about how much you loved the way your father used to read to you at night. And Charles, you wrote in the margins of your school notebooks how much you admired him. Those feelings don't just disappear." Sophie's lips trembled as she opened. The diary, her fingers tracing the pages as though reconnecting with a younger version of herself. "I did love those nights," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Charles looked at her, his usually stoic face cracking under the weight of emotion. "I wanted to hate him," he admitted. "I thought it was easier to blame him than to face the truth about what we lost." Mr. Henry, who had remained silent until now, stood slowly, his frail frame seeming to grow stronger with the courage he summoned. "I never stopped loving either of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I did, I thought it was to protect you, but in trying to protect you, I lost you, and for that I am deeply sorry." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she looked at her father for the first time in years. "Why didn't you just tell us? We would have understood." "Because I was a coward," Mr. Henry admitted. "I didn't think I deserved your forgiveness, and I didn't know how to ask for it." Charles stepped closer, his hand trembling as he placed it on his father's shoulder. "We lost so much time, but maybe it's not too late." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of years of pain and regret hanging in the air. Then Sophie stepped forward, wrapping her arms around her father. "I just wanted you to fight for us," she said through tears. "I'm here now," Mr. Henry replied, his voice breaking, "and I'll keep fighting, as long as you'll let me." Charles joined the embrace, and for the first time in years, the family felt whole again. Lucas watched from a distance, a quiet smile on his face. His heart swelled with a mixture of pride and relief. He had done it. He had brought them back together. William approached Lucas, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than anyone could have hoped for. Thank you." Lucas shook his head. "They did it themselves. They just needed a reminder of what they had." As the family sat together, sharing stories and laughter, the rift that once divided them began to heal. Lucas knew this was just the beginning, but it was a beginning filled with hope and promise. Later that evening, as Lucas prepared to leave, Mr. Henry pulled him aside. "You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever," he said, "and I want you to know that you'll always be part of this family." Lucas smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, Mr. Henry. That means everything to me." As Lucas walked out into the cool night air, he felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. He had set out to help a man reconnect with his family, but in doing so, he had found his own sense of belonging. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as if reflecting the hope that now filled his heart. The following months brought changes that Lucas could have never imagined. The Henry family, once fractured and distant, began to rebuild their lives together. Charles started visiting his father regularly, and Sophie, who had once harbored so much resentment, found herself calling Mr. Henry just to chat about her day. The wounds weren't entirely healed, but the scars were no longer barriers. They were reminders of what they had overcome. For Lucas, life also transformed in ways he could scarcely believe. With Mr. Henry's sponsorship, he was now attending a new school, equipped with resources he never thought he'd have access to. His prosthetic leg, once a daunting challenge, had become a part of him. He walked with confidence, no longer defined by his limitations, but by the strength he carried within. But Mr. Henry's gratitude for Lucas extended far beyond personal gestures. He had a bigger plan, a way to turn Lucas's story into something that would ripple across their community. One afternoon, Mr. Henry invited Lucas and his mother to the mansion for an announcement. As they sat in the living room, surrounded by the warmth of a family that Lucas had helped reunite, Mr. Henry stood and cleared his throat. "Lucas," he began, his voice full of emotion, "you taught me something that I had forgotten. Kindness isn't just a gift we give to others. It's a bridge that connects us, even in the darkest of times. You didn't just change my life, you reminded me of the man I wanted to be. And now I want to honor you in a way that ensures your impact is felt far and wide." Lucas tilted his head, confused but intrigued. "What do you mean?" "We're starting the Lucas Foundation," Mr. Henry explained, a proud smile on his face. "A program dedicated to providing prosthetics, education, and resources for children who face challenges like you've faced. No child should feel limited by their circumstances, and with this foundation, we'll make sure they don't." Lucas's jaw dropped. He looked at his mother, who had tears streaming down her face, and then back at Mr. Henry. I don't know what to say." "You've already said everything through your actions," Mr. Henry replied. "Now, we're going to make sure your kindness inspires generations." The foundation's launch was a grand event held in the mansion's sprawling garden. Families from all walks of life gathered, sharing stories of resilience and hope. Lucas was the guest of honor, and as he stood on stage to speak, he felt the weight of every moment that had brought him here. "When I helped Mr. Henry that day," Lucas began, his voice steady but full of emotion, "I didn't think much about it. I just did what I thought was right. But that simple act changed my life. It taught me that even the smallest kindness can grow into something bigger than we ever imagined. And now we have the chance to make that kind of difference for so many others." The crowd erupted into applause, but Lucas's eyes were on Mr. Henry, who nodded proudly. After the event, Lucas wandered through the garden, reflecting on how far he had come. Mr. Henry approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've created something incredible here, Lucas. This foundation is your legacy." Lucas smiled. "No, Mr. Henry, it's ours." The two stood in silence for a moment, watching as children ran through the garden, laughing and playing. Lucas's heart swelled with gratitude. His life, once defined by struggle, was now a beacon of hope for others, and it all began with a simple act of kindness on a busy street. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lucas turned to Mr. Henry. "Thank you for believing in me." Mr. Henry shook his head. "Thank you for reminding me to believe in people." And with that, Lucas stepped forward into a future he had never dreamed possible, knowing that the path he had walked, though difficult, had him exactly where he was meant to be. Did this story touch your heart? Here at Living Narratives, we pour our time and care into bringing you heartfelt stories that inspire deep reflection on life and the power of empathy. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Your support means everything to us and helps us continue sharing stories that inspire and connect. Share in the comments what this story meant to you and let us know where you're watching from. And don't miss the chance to explore other videos on our channel, each one crafted to touch your soul. Thank you for being a part of our community. See you in the next chapter of emotions here at Living Narratives.